Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the podcast. The idea for today is to present some books to you that Michael and me found impactful and that had a lasting effect on our lives. Mostly these are going to be titles, at least some titles that I listened for this episode, about spirituality, psychology, and things that really shifted my mindset in a significant way. And I hold some of these books dearly, and some of them I reread a couple of times, and each time I take out new things, or perhaps I've forgotten from before, but they keep bringing value to my life. And that's why I would love to try to spread some of these and make people aware in case there aren't some of these. So yeah, we have both a list of books that were super impactful for us. And let's see how far we go. Maybe we get to like 5 books each. Let's see. But yeah, maybe we can, since we're talking about like impact on our lives, maybe we can do this somehow chronologically. And I'm going to start off with the first book that had an impact on me on this list, which has been actually Wherever You Go, There You Are by Jon Kabat-Zinn. And I added this book to a list because it was really my introduction. This was when I first got interested into meditation, Buddhism, and somebody handed me this book and was like, yeah, if you're interested in meditation, but you want to see it kind of like from a scientific perspective, this is the book to start with. Like, don't go into spiritual texts or Buddhistic texts or whatever. It might be too strange for you. Yeah, and what can I say? They really nailed it, because it really made me try meditation in my early 20s, and it made me understand mindfulness. And by the way, I think the term mindfulness was even coined by Jon Kabat-Zinn. He's the one who brought it to the West and kind of established it. So, all of the big meditation movements we have in the West right now and all the popularity, I think, is to some degree the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn. And yeah, it really shifts my perspective on so many things. Like, what I really learned from this book was, I think, the very basic and simple idea, which was not basic and simple back then to me, and was, we are not our thoughts. We perceive our thoughts. And just a simple idea, made me sit basically hours and hours. Obviously not at a time, because meditation is really difficult in the beginning to sit like for a long time. Probably I was just like meditating for 15 minutes a day. But nevertheless, in some hours and hours spent just, interrogating that idea and yeah, really having some shifts based on that. And maybe, I would squeeze in here another book, because shortly after that, kind of on the same thought, I read also The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, which, is maybe even more accessible for people interested in meditation and the idea of meditation, because it doesn't even try to justify it so much with science and science-backed facts and studies and whatever, but more of the, let's say, personal experience and life story of Eckhart Tolle nevertheless conveys a very similar but great message and makes clear what the benefit is of meditation in one's life. So yeah, that's my number one.
Yeah, that's cool. I like those. And I also like that you started with something a little bit more practical. I kind of started on a different point myself. And, interestingly, I have Jon Kabat-Zinn book on my shelf, and I've never read it. I've never read any of his stuff. And so, yeah, that feels like a good recommendation. the one I have is Coming to Our Senses. Yeah. And similarly, also enjoy Eckhart Tolle, although the first time I read The Power of Now, and I think maybe I've only read it once, it didn't resonate with me all that much. It didn't land for me. I like his other book, A New Earth. I felt it kind of spoke to me a little bit more. So, I guess that's just a note for anyone out there that, if you have read one or the other, and it didn't quite do it for you, you might try the opposite one. But in any case, the first book for me, trying to think back, it's a little challenging, but I think probably Autobiography of a Yogi. So this is one that I often recommend to people. It's by Yogananda. It's basically kind of his life story, I guess you'd say. It talks a lot about his gurus and some of his more, kind of out there type experiences. And I think probably what was most impactful aspect of this book was really just the language that he uses. Like, it's very sophisticated. It's very, every time I read the book, I usually learn like a new word. I have to go look something up. I come across something I don't quite remember what it means, or I don't know what it means, and I have to go look it up. And just, he's so eloquent in the way that he writes, the way that he describes things. And then I also have found it very inspirational. I kind of return to it every so often, every couple of years. I'll reread it or listen to it. And, it's just all of the things that he went through. And of course, some of it is a little bit challenging to totally accept on face value. But personally, I just find it kind of inspirational. And whether or not it's all true, I really have no idea. Personally, I'm inclined to believe it, but maybe I'm a little bit more, I don't know. I don't want to use the word gullible, but I guess I'll throw that out there. So yeah, for example, at the end of the book, if you have the orange version, there's a couple different versions out there. If you have the orange one, it has like a letter from the coroner in New York that examined his body after he died. And apparently, I think it was like 29 days, 3 or 4 weeks after he died, and the coroner is examining the body and says that they could find no evidence of, like normal decay. And so sometimes, like in the yogic tradition, this is known as like incorruptibility. Like basically your body after the yogi dies doesn't seem to decay. I mean, I don't know how far that extends or anything. I imagine they're kind of interred after, a month or so. But yeah, it's kind of just an interesting thing. And then just some of the experiences that he talks about are pretty far out there. He talks about his guru, kind of after his guru's death, that he visits him. He kind of comes to him maybe like in a dream and explains kind of the makeup of the universe in a way. He talks about the different planes of existence, for example, in particular, the astral plane. And it's just really interesting to kind of get that yogic, like very deep perspective on things. So yeah, that's one that I always like to recommend to people. If you're a little put off by the fantastic stories, then maybe not that one. And I'll slip another one in here as well. Actually, I might throw a couple in, but another one kind of in a similar vein. If you're into like yogi, disciple, guru kind of books that talk about some, wild stuff like that. There's one called At the 11th Hour. I think this one's about Sri M and Swami. Boy, I'm not going to remember his name. But in any case, some kind of high up there yogi guru guys. Again, also just very, very inspirational, and it's almost like a fairy tale in a way. So personally, I really enjoy those books. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at those ones for now. So what else do you got for us, Nick?
Yeah, before I jump to the next one, just also want to comment on that, because this book you consistently bring up like at least once a month or something like that. And I know it has been impactful for you. I gotta say, I don't find it accessible at all. Like I gave it now several tries. I think, I got to maybe page 40 or something like that. And I'm not even sure like what I find problematic with it, but it's just the fact that you said fantastical stories, almost like fairy tale story of his life, is just told. And there's just some very, if you're not so much into yogic tradition, which I'm not like super knowledgeable about, there's just some fantastic details about, his parents and just whatever happened to him, and some like spiritual experiences where there's not a lot of like explanation and context around it. It's just like, yeah, and then this and that happened, like, what the hell? And there needs to be a chapter explaining like what is going on. But I guess, maybe that's also what fascinates people so much, whether that then, they dive deeper into yogic tradition and like how these things possible. Like one day I'll read the whole book, but so far, I somehow could never do that. And I don't know how that works. And sometimes, we're just put off by some books. And sometimes it's also that you're maybe not ready for a book, in a sense that, you need to read some other books. You need to first read into the topic or something like that to be, so that your mind is prepared to like comprehend whatever the book brings. But yeah, I do find that curious because you keep bringing up this title.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that perspective. And I think that's one of the reasons that, our talks can be so interesting. And hey, I mean, I don't necessarily think that it's about being ready for it, but if it doesn't resonate with you, then, I wouldn't force it on yourself, maybe at some point it will, and maybe it never will, right? Like maybe it just doesn't have any good messages for you. So kind of similarly, there are a number of books that I feel like I should read or something, and I've attempted, and they just don't resonate. They don't stick. So that I guess that's just kind of a note to like, follow your intuition on this. Find a book that really resonates, that you're going to enjoy reading, rather than just someone raves about. Right? And if someone raves about it and you don't care for it, then don't force it on yourself.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, but there's also these these kind of titles that are just floating also around, let's say, in the community of people, seeking spiritual experiences, introspecting and so on, that you keep hearing about and somehow, can understand like, what is it about that book? One of them is also what I hear constantly people rave about is like the Four Agreements. And I was trying to, I started reading this and I was like, wow, this is so shallow. Like, what did people take away from this? But, whatever floats your boat, I guess.
Yeah. No, I've read that one. I'm maybe a little bit on the fence. I wouldn't necessarily like strongly recommend it, but there's kind of, I don't know, not quite the right word, but simple or mundane in a sense. It is kind of like almost obvious in a way, but it's one of those things that maybe we don't pay much attention to in a way. But yeah, that's another good one. Yeah. Okay. I'll let you go.
Right. Next, I wanted to have one book, at least on the list, that needs to be about psychedelics. I was wondering, like, there isn't that many good books I read about that. I mean, there's How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, but at that phase, I already had like plenty of experience, so it wasn't like really mind blowing. And I was thinking back, and I remember that I actually read The Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman, and I remember that this was the thing that really piqued my interest, and where I understood, okay, I somehow need to try, DMT or ayahuasca, because I understood from the book that it's kind of a similar experience, or that it has the same molecule. But it was the first time I understood that spirituality and psychedelics can be intertwined. And there was like lots of people in this book telling their experiences of, I don't know, meeting God. And somehow that piqued the interest, because, I was always interested in those questions about like, what is God? What is the universe? About those base spiritual questions, but no philosophy thus far I delved into had given satisfactory answers. And there was these people that basically said, yeah, there's this pill you take, or you smoke in this case, and you basically meet God and it changes your life forever. And this was really, since I read that book, I was like, what the hell? This thing is this? This is real. This is not a fictional book. And, from then started seeking basically like, where's an opportunity where I can try out this stuff? Yeah. And then I tried ayahuasca, and it was really like, had a huge impact, shifted my life in so many different ways that we could go into, but, we already talked about it so many times. But yeah, I think this is really an explosive book, like somebody who is interested on a surface level in psychedelics and spirituality, and you read this book, like I think it can really pique your interest. That's why it has to be there.
Yeah. Another one I haven't read another should book for me. Maybe I'll have to check it out sometime. Let's see. On the psychedelic side, I'm going to have to look up the title of this one. I think it's called the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Check it out. But it was one of the earliest psychedelic books that I read. Let's see. Yeah, okay. It's called the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journeys. It's by this guy, James Fadiman, who's been in psychedelic space for quite some time. And I think what was most impactful about this book for me was that it showed the kind of how to work with psychedelics on a very practical level, and what kind of impact that can have. So, for example, the anecdote from this book that really stands out to me was, I think it was like an architect or somebody that took LSD and then was able to, he found, to really envision the building that he was trying to design down to like just incredible level of detail. And it really showed to me how something like LSD or any psychedelics can be used like in a very practical way, how it can have practical applications in that sense, how it can, like alter the way that we're capable of thinking about something on that kind of level. And so I think that one was pretty impactful for me. Probably need to revisit it, but it is like just a number of stories about, how people have utilized it and various different discoveries. I don't remember if it talks about it or not, but this is something we probably mentioned, that a person who discovered the double helix, I think they might have kind of come up with that idea on LSD trip. I might be getting that wrong, but I think that, yeah. So it was pretty good, a pretty good book. James Fadiman is somewhat popularized from his protocol for microdosing. So it talks a lot about microdosing, and he came up with the protocol. He's been trying to collect research on it. Like if you go to his website and you follow his protocol, you can download like a document for his protocol. And then if you follow it for some time, he likes to get feedback from people just, kind of for research purposes. And yeah, so he's an interesting guy in that space, and definitely kind of legitimizing psychedelic use. So that was an early one for me on psychedelics.
Yeah, I remember his protocol. Like when I delved into microdosing, you can't get around his name, and the research he brings together. Another honorable mention for me, like if we talk about psychedelics, is definitely The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley.
Yeah.
Where he just talks about taking mescaline kind of on an ordinary day, and just really describes in depth how that influences his perception, which is not an easy task, but I think he does a pretty good job. And, I read this before ever trying LSD, and then afterwards I was like, yeah, it's pretty much nailed. I understand like why people recommend this book. Yeah, anything else regarding psychedelics?
I'd throw my hat in on Doors of Perception as well. That one's pretty impactful for me. I mean, it's a fairly short essay that you can find online, so I'd highly recommend seeking it out and reading it. I think in particular what impacts me from, honestly, all of Aldous Huxley's writing is that he comes from a family of scientists, and he's he's a highly intelligent person, right? And just to see the way that he explored psychedelics and the way that he articulates the experience is pretty profound. And I think he also famously had his sister dose him on his deathbed. I think he took LSD as he was dying. So yeah, that's my contribution to Doors of Perception. Highly recommend it.
Nice. That's the ultimate psychonaut move, to be tripping before death. Yeah. Speaking about Psychonaut, I also have on my list somewhere The Way of the Psychonaut by Stanislav Grof. And there's another famous one, which I can't remember the title, but for anybody who doesn't know, Stanislav Grof was the Czech psychotherapist who researched LSD while it was still legal and held hundreds, if not thousands, of sessions of psychedelic assisted therapy, if you want so, with LSD. And then when it was illegalized, he switched to breathwork, basically. And he has deep research into transcendent stages, or transcendent states, rather. And it's really interesting because he actually maps out this territory of the transcendent, or as he calls it, the transpersonal space, whatever happens when you transcend the human experience. And he had these unique tools of holotropic breathwork and also all of his research with LSD. And he extensively also writes about birth trauma. And that's also something really interesting. Like he comes, he's one of the people that believes that that birth is inevitably a traumatic experience, that we all, basically, even if somebody doesn't have trauma in their life, birth is a traumatic experience. And he bases that on the fact that people consistently go to their birth trauma when they go into deep holotropic states, and that this is basically the doorway to the transpersonal space. So it's basically when you dealt with the birth trauma and you do what people think of as, let's say, rebirthing, that then, this is basically the doorway, and then you can enter a space of perhaps like past lifetimes and things like that. So it's really interesting for anybody who wants to dive deep on what is possible with a psychedelic experience and transpersonally at all. So yeah, just also wants to throw it in. If we want to like wrap up the part where we talk about psychedelics, I think we have to mention them.
Yeah. I really enjoy Stanislav Grof's stuff as well, so I'd second that. Yeah, it's a little dense, a little long from what I recall. And I'd also throw that warning as far as How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan's book. I found that one a little dense personally.
Yeah, whereas the second one is actually 2 books and like 500 pages each or something like that.
Okay, cool. Well, if we're wrapping up psychedelic recommendations, what about things on the more practical side? Are there any books that you're like, yeah, this is really good? Like if you want to just learn techniques, if you want to learn how to actually apply meditation or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good category, because immediately 2 books come to mind, which, most likely have been the most impactful. And I don't know in which order. No, actually, I think I read first The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. And this is for me, it symbolizes basically what you just said is basically meditation in motion, because this guy came up with a framework, or just with this idea of not resisting and how that can impact your life. And, the effects of that are just incredible. Like really, when I read this book, I was struck by it, because you can immediately apply it. You can immediately relate it to your personal experience. I think this is especially valuable for somebody who deals with stress in their life. And I think I read it in times where my life was or felt stressful. And it completely reframed my idea of what stress is, what resisting means, all of this friction that comes from not accepting life and standing in the way of life. And yeah, this is probably the single most reread book on my list. And I really can't recommend this one enough. Like, if somebody asks me like, what is the most impactful book? Probably that one.
Yeah, I dig that, and I'll second that. Just Michael Singer in general. He's got a podcast now, so you can listen to most of his talks pretty easily. And then he has, I think it's 3 books. So there's the Surrender Experiment, which is kind of more a little bit autobiographical. And I'd put that one kind of like in the inspirational category, because it's like, what can your life actually look like if you apply these principles? and then The Untethered Soul, which was probably his kind of most famous, most ubiquitous book. And then his newest one, I think, is Living Untethered, which, between The Untethered Soul and Living Untethered, it's hard to say. Living Untethered almost feels a little bit like a refinement of The Untethered Soul. It goes over so much of the same stuff. Yeah, so if I were going to make a single Michael Singer recommendation, I'd probably go with Living Untethered. But similar to what you're saying, it's it's interesting to call this one practical, because he very rarely, one of Michael Singer's things is he doesn't want to give you a technique, although he does, right? He does give you techniques like throughout the book, and fairly simple techniques. And I kind of appreciate that about him, that he doesn't say like, oh, this is the way to do it, or that's the way to do it. He kind of just gives you like the general principle behind the practices. And yeah, that book was very impactful for me. I guess I'd just say Michael Singer's work has been very impactful for me and caused me to start kind of like very intentionally practicing surrender. And that's been very, very impactful in my journey over the last few years. Kind of just in particular working with the small things, which is one of kind of the tenets of his teaching, is to work with what he calls the low-hanging fruit. And I think that's probably one of the most useful pieces of advice when it comes to certainly surrender, but even like meditation or any of these spiritual practices in general, is just to kind of like limit yourself and just be kind of humble in a sense about the way that you apply it. Right. So yeah, I really enjoy Michael Singer's work and second that recommendation.
Yeah. So surrender is the right word that he uses a lot in the book. And, it's one of the terms, since we talked previously about like books about psychedelics, surrender is a big topic when doing psychedelics.
Yeah.
So when you come from that space, you're already familiar with the importance of that. But Untethered Soul has nothing to do with psychedelics. He talks about surrender, in regular life, if you want so. And that was a really cool learning that, oh, wow, okay, this stuff I know from the psychedelic space can be applied to regular life, and it can have an impact. It can shift your perspective on life like that. That was amazing. And we talked about this before, but Michael Singer has this, I don't know, I have the feeling that the message he brings across, it's like if you break down The Untethered Soul, it's a book that could work basically with, 2 pages, something like that, like of the main message. But nevertheless, he manages to bring so many angles to this principle, let's say, that it really clicks. And it is such a simple thing, but you can talk about it from so many angles, because it's said the same way as it's simple, it's also complex, right? Surrender is one of those things. It's like almost paradoxical. And he has this podcast where he talks, I think he's still doing that on Sounds True or somewhere, where almost each week, he just releases like 1 hour podcast about this topic. And I feel like this is all stuff I read about in The Untethered Soul, yet I feel like every time I listen to it, wow, okay, this was like a new angle, and I kind of redid the same lesson, but, have now more context to it. So yeah, Michael Singer is really special for that one, let's say. And so then the next book, which would be in a similar category, or is related, I think I also read it shortly afterwards, when I was interested in the topic of surrender. And it's Letting Go by Hawkins, which has, I think, a very similar message. So, it's almost the same topic. It's like letting go, surrendering, a very similar principle, let's say, but coming from somebody who brings a bit more, let's say, method to it and tries to explain a little bit more like why those things that he explains work that way. So Hawkins, the author, actually speaks about, also in this book, about an experience that he had, I think as a child, where he felt like he left his body and was basically enlightenment for an eternity or whatever, and he kind of at one point decided to, come back to his body and still live on this earth for one lifetime, and then try to, also share whatever he learned there. And he came up with this scale of consciousness where, at the very top, there would be something like pure love, Christ consciousness, and some of the more negative emotions more lower on the scale. And it goes to, I don't remember the number, was it to 1,000, something like that, 900 or whatever. And he basically describes that by not letting go, we're basically attached to a certain frequency, let's say, on the scale of consciousness. And thus, kind of explains the mechanics of consciousness and why life happens the way it happens, and how exactly surrender can be used to rise up the scale of consciousness, and thus like how your life changes, how your perspective changes. And yeah, this brought again more depth to kind of the similar idea, and also kind of solidified it for me, because also this person seems very knowledgeable and had this really interesting ideas that he brought in, but just solidified kind of the same concept like Untethered Soul.
Yeah. Another one I'd totally agree with. I feel like it's very complementary to Michael Singer's work, but I would also throw out that I'm sure there are some people that could come across letting go, or just David Hawkins in general, and be kind of put off because he is a little bit more on kind of the woo side of things, I guess you could say. But in that regard, I actually appreciate the way that he'll like describe some of his experiences, whereas Michael Singer kind of doesn't really go into, I mean, he does talk about it a little bit, but he doesn't talk about like any transcendent experiences that he personally had, at least that I can really recall. He doesn't go into that so much, whereas David Hawkins, I feel like, does a lot more, especially the anecdote that you were talking, which I remember him being an adult in that one, but maybe those were two different stories. I don't quite recall. But yeah, David Hawkins is definitely very interesting. So I'd recommend his stuff as well, sort of just with that caveat that, it is a little bit more on the fantastic side, which I think is good.
It's not for everybody. I think even it's not for everybody who is into spirituality, because not everybody believes in enlightenment. And this guy kind of occasionally talks in this anecdote about it. Yeah, I was enlightened for some time. Yeah, I'm not put off by that kind of stuff. If nothing, it piques my interest even more. I like crazy people like that who straight up write about those experiences. But yeah, it's very true. It's actually the very difference between those two, that Michael Singer is very down to earth and just learns based on whatever is in front of you rather than something abstract.
Yeah. So I kind of want to recommend this book that I'm listening to right now. So just throwing that caveat in there that I'm not all the way through it. And it's called Sensory Motor Psychotherapy. I came across it on the somatic experiencing subreddits in their sidebar, and it happened to be free on Audible at this time. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to listen to this. And it is like just highly, highly practical. In particular, what's been, my biggest takeaway is just how significantly things like trauma impact the way that we show up in the world and how we experience things. And kind of how it's almost how it is really communicated through our body language, through the sound of our voice, right? It like actually changes because of these impacts that we've had throughout our life. It changes the way that it changes our posture. It changes tension in your body. How significantly it impacts us all over. It changes the way that you walk, right? And so what I really like this is it starts to kind of bring a new dimension, or kind of a new point of focus for so it talks a lot about somatic therapy, which is basically what it is. It's just kind of their flavor of somatic therapy. But it's super practical. It's got like lots of workbook type stuff throughout it. It's got a PDF that it comes with, and basically a lot of it is geared towards self-awareness of, for example, your posture and the way that you walk, and then understanding how these things may have kind of developed. So for example, if, as a child, maybe you were taught that it wasn't okay to like be proud of your accomplishments, or, you got kind of, let's just say, were like whacked if you, stood tall and, puffed your chest out. And so you might have developed a tendency as like a survival mechanism to have kind of a very hunched posture, keeping your head down, not making eye contact with people. And these are behaviors that kind of persist into adulthood, and eventually they kind of just become transparent in the sense that you think, oh, well, that's just the way that I am, right? But to start being able to see them through this lens of, like usually childhood trauma, and to be able to recognize that, okay, this was a way that my body learned to cope with these situations when it thought that it wasn't safe, when we've talked about this a little bit, faulty neuroception, right? When your body thinks that it's in danger because it recognizes a certain pattern in your experience that triggers traumatic experiences from childhood. And, it kind of tends to happen. We don't know that it's happening, right? So we can kind of start to deconstruct our experience by kind of like dissecting what exactly is happening to us, physiologically in terms of our body. And this book has just done a really awesome job of kind of enlightening me on the topic and just giving me a lot more dimensions to examine in my own experience and bring awareness to. So I'm really enjoying it, so much so that I'd even throw out a recommendation for it.
Yeah, I recently got interested again in that topic, specifically like posture and how it indicates but also influences the psychological state. And it's basically very subtle changes can have an incredible impact there, because based on how, for example, straight your posture is, that's going to determine, how tense muscles are in certain areas on your back, for example. That in turn is going to regulate how constricted your chest is. How constricted your chest is going to regulate how much oxygen you can take in. How much oxygen you can take in is going to regulate how well your digestion works. How well the digestion works is going to regulate how great or not great you feel, because as we also know by now, the gut and the brain are very connected. And it's these small changes that can have a great impact. An interesting question there in this field that I think about a lot is, how do these things come about? Is it that your posture is bad first, and then, let's say, your mind and your spirit respond to that constriction? Or is it that you experience something traumatic and your body adapts to that and holds that posture for protection? You know what I mean? Or is it something in between? I don't know. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah. It's kind of an interesting chicken and egg kind of problem, like which came first exactly. Yeah, and I guess the way that I've kind of always thought about it is they tend to, I think, arise together, right? Like they're, in a sense, they're just different facets of the same thing, right? So like developing tendency towards poor posture in childhood because, when you have good posture, that ends up getting, negative attention from your caretakers or something, right? And so as a survival, adaptation, you end up having this, hunched posture, and that kind of correlates with this more, I guess I'll just describe it as like more introverted type social tendencies, right? And I think that they're almost in a sense one and the same. And one of the really impactful things about understanding this for me is it shows how important it is to work on all of these levels, right? So what comes to mind for me is that this is one of the reasons that just talk therapy in and of itself might not be super effective, because these tendencies, even if you understand something like on a mental level, like, oh, I don't want to be, really shy and reserved in these situations, your posture and the way that the patterns that your body plays out they're almost kind of like this rubber band that brings you back to this habitual way of being, right? And so I think that it's really important to be able to work through things on the mental level, but also on the emotional and physiological, on the physical level, right? Like the somatic level. Because the way I see it is, if you don't bring awareness to and change your posture, for example, then even the changes that you make on the mental level don't necessarily stick, because it's almost like the posture just kind of pulls them back to that habitual response to the world. So yeah, I think that's one of the really impactful aspects about just somatic therapy in general for me.
Mm-hmm. And yes, that's a good way or a good point to mention. I mean, one of the most impactful works in that space anyways is The Body Keeps the Score. I guess that, for many people kind of kickstarted this whole discussion about, what is the somatic layer, like how is the body affected by trauma? Even there is a connection, the connection with tension held in the body. Although for me, maybe more impactful was the work of Peter Levine, Waking the Tiger, I guess. And, basically getting into polyvagal theory. And, because it took me from understanding just, there's tension in the body, like the body holds trauma in certain spots. And this is how chronic pain, for example, can come about. Like that was something that is very logical, I guess. But the next step was understanding the nervous system and like its role in this whole thing, in trauma, in the states of the nervous system, the fight, flight, freeze, and so on. And really, so Peter Levine, I guess, is the founder of somatic experiencing, like a method still widely used in psychotherapy to exactly work on both of those levels, right? They work a lot with perception of the mind and the body. It works with getting safe in the body again. It acknowledges the fact that people who went through a certain trauma are basically in a constant sympathetic nervous system state that can create a lot of damage. And yeah, I think for me personally, it shifted my understanding of psychology, because psychology no longer was this thing that we can, approach from this singular angle of there's something wrong on the mental level, there's mental illnesses, there's something wrong with the mind, you need to work with the mind, you need to work with analysis, that's psychology. But to honest, it's basically a really holistic picture of whatever's going on with people that experience trauma. So that was a really big shift for me as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, he did kind of found, I guess, somatic experiencing, and just kind of really, really helped that kind of come to light a lot more. I totally recommend both his books. I would think Waking the Tiger, and I think his more recent one, which is very, very similar. It's called In an Unspoken Voice. And in that one, he actually shares one of his own experiences of, he was crossing a crosswalk and he got hit by a car, and an ambulance comes and picks him up, and he's having this conversation with the EMT, the medic in the ambulance, and he's allowing his body to kind of complete the motion. So essentially when the car hit him, his body wanted to like put his arms up and kind of brace, but for whatever reason, he wasn't able to do that. And so his body has like this unfinished, I guess you could say like unfinished business in a sense. And this can actually lead to, if the body isn't able to complete its motions, it can lead to like chronic tension, and it can lead to a lack of mobility, right? Like limited range of motion. And so while he's being taken to the hospital, he's like actually allowing his arm to like go up in sort of this protective type stance, and just to kind of complete the motion. And he's having this kind of interesting conversation with the EMT, who's kind of understanding what he's doing, and they're kind of like talking about the somatic and the psychology kind of behind it. Just really interesting. So that was one of my big takeaways from those books. But yeah, I'd recommend those as well. Let's see, and also totally recommend Body Keeps the Score as well. The big thing for me in that book was that it kind of exposes you to a lot of different modalities of therapy, right? Like the author personally goes through and experiences, like, one that comes to mind a lot is constellation therapy, which is an interesting one. But yeah, I think he talks about EMDR as well, but that's another really good one when it comes to understanding trauma in the body. Let's see, what other book do I want to throw in here? Okay, kind of also on the practical side, a little bit more on the mind side and less on the body side. I want to throw in like Marshall Rosenberg's books, Nonviolent Communication. I think he has another one called like Speaking Peace or something. And what I really like about these books is it gives a very practical framework for navigating like fights, navigating disputes in relationships. And he doesn't necessarily talk about this aspect too much, but one of the ways that I've come to apply it is in my relationship to myself. And so I won't go into it too much since we talked about nonviolent communication somewhat recently, but basically just this phrase that really sticks with me that Marshall Rosenberg uses, that some of our less desired behaviors and emotions and thoughts that come up can be seen as, his phrase is, tragic expressions of unmet needs, right? And so to just kind of like take it easy on ourselves and recognize that so much of the habitual ways that we show up in the world are, in a sense, not really our fault, right? Which I really appreciate. And kind of from the somatic perspective, going back to that, it is basically saying that, that these were survival mechanisms and they just, have maybe become a little bit dysfunctional as we grow up and become adults and they're no longer needed. But just to understand why they're there kind of takes a little bit of the guilt and weight off of it. So I find that to be pretty valuable. And then also just the way that he helps you learn to rephrase things. And another thing that's really stuck with me is understanding judgment versus just being more observing, right? Like fact versus judgment, I guess you could say, and recognizing how our language and our thoughts are just so replete, I guess you could say, with judgment. And we're really not engaging with facts very often. More often, we're engaging with the meaning that we made from those facts. And we can get so deep into that often it kind of becomes like, it's our story, it's our delusion, it's the world that we live in a lot of ways. And it's not necessarily based on truth in a sense, it's based on our interpretation of it. So that's just something that really resonated with me and kind of relates to so much of what we talk about, and certainly, it's almost very Buddhist in a sense, right? That we're suffering our interpretations. So yeah, that's a really impactful one for me. So I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true. Based on experience, like one of the reasons I started, adding to my communication a lot of like repeating and kind of reflecting people back and trying to understand if I understood them correctly is because oftentimes I really didn't, or it happens often to me that I talk about something with somebody and then the next day we talk about it again and they memorize this thing or this conversation completely different. And I think it goes back to, what you just explained, that we just understand things differently. And even language is not, equal for everybody. It seems that the references we store for certain words in our minds are not necessarily the same. So that's something, definitely, to be kept in mind, and especially in communication.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. It's been very impactful in my relationships to understand that the way that people remember things is usually through sort of like almost a collapse of the facts into an interpretation, right? It's almost in a sense like shorthand. You have all of these facts and it's, exactly what happened, but it's really hard to remember a situation like that through that lens, right? And so we tend to remember things through our lens of how we interpret it. And that can even like change the words that we remember, and we remember something like totally different from somebody else in a situation. And, so the way that I personally use that is just to, like you said, kind of being more open-minded with people and just recognizing, okay, the way that I interpreted this situation, the other person might not see it that way. And neither of them are like right or wrong necessarily.
So yeah, now we're delving really into psychology, and there's really a couple of books I'm really eager actually to tell you about. But on the other hand, we're already like talking for 50 minutes or so. So what do you think? Should we just save these for a part 2, and where we continue a bit more in psychology and perhaps like other fields?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I feel like I could go a little bit deeper. I guess I'm really curious to hear what books you're eager to say, and then maybe we can just leave it at that. I mean, we don't have to go super deep into them. Maybe we can revisit them.
Okay, so I start with one that was really impactful, like in the more recent time, and it's Trauma and the Soul by Donald Kalsched was his name. And why this one in particular was so impactful for me was because I'm really interested in Jungians, and also in the work of his followers like Jungian analysts and so on. And Daniel is one of them, and I'm super interested in the idea of shadow and the idea of the psyche and the trauma has on it, and the fact that the psyche gets fragmented, basically. And he does a great job at explaining specifically how that leads to dissociation. And that basically, once somebody is like heavily traumatized, I think he calls it the flight of flesh, is basically you're still there, but you're not as present and as alive anymore in your body, because parts of your soul have been basically fragmented away, stored away together with some event that happened. Because whatever event happened was too intense for your awareness to be processed, basically. And it's basically waiting there to be processed at one point, but blocking away, really parts of your personality. And, so it really becomes clear for me, like, how depersonalization happens, how depression happens, how dissociation in general happens for people. And, it's just another of those examples where it's kind of tragic, because what happens with dissociation and with this fragmentation is that you're not really aware of it. It kind of locks away parts of your personality, and also it kind of locks away your own protective behaviors around it. So it's one of those things where you might not be even aware that, this is happening. So you encounter a situation which in some terms is like similar, like the traumatic experience that you have. The protective mechanisms kick in and you completely avoid the situation, or you do some weird, complex behaviors to avoid them, completely regaining unconscious of the fact that something was touched there, and thus keeping you safe, because the past experience showed that, these kind of situations are not safe. So I guess this also reiterates one of the points that you made earlier about the safety mechanisms we have in place, both in the body and in the mind, that protect us of things, and that we need to basically then now get rid of later on. But what definitely helps is recognizing that those behaviors serve the purpose and they did a job. They protected your awareness and then the self of completely fracturing by hiding it away from you. And it is inconvenient, and now you have all of this stuff stored in your body. You have tension, you might have chronic pain, you might dissociate, these things happen. But probably the first step is acknowledging that this thing was helpful for you. That it created this separate persona inside yourself that is similar to the protector of internal family systems, if you want so. That is there for a reason, and that helped you, and that you can be thankful for. Yeah, and then in the book, he goes also into detail, how can we now undo whatever is done. But this kind of, cemented for me the idea that Jung had about fragmentation of the soul. And it also brings in spirituality, which is, sometimes in psychology kind of taboo to also give this spiritual perspective and even, talk about soul and stuff is a bit frowned upon. So that was the first one I wanted to definitely add for, if we talk about books about psychology.
Well, yeah, I like that, almost like a little teaser for another similar conversation. Because I'm sure we could go on with this. And that book was called Trauma to the Soul?
Trauma and the Soul.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's one I'll have to look up. And I totally agree. That idea of fragmentation is very powerful and very useful just in terms of understanding ourselves. So yeah, sounds like a good one. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's other ones which we could go into specifically around the topic of fear. There's one famous one, I think in English it's called Anxiety by Fritz Riemann, and talked like about the base 4 types of fear. I think that will be super useful for, anybody dealing with like fear-based disorders to dive into. Then there's Man's Search of Meaning. Yeah, I don't know. I still have a couple ones that I'd like to push out there. So yeah, let's see if maybe later on we do another one of those.
Sounds good. Well, I guess for anyone listening, if you have any book recommendations for us, we're always open to it, always looking to find my next good read. So yeah, add it to the comments or whatever. Email us.